why would a championship-caliber player willingly accept a $35,000 fine before the league even announced it? On Monday, the NBA fined Boston Celtics star Jaylen Brown $35,000 for public criticism of officiating. The fine came in response to extended comments Brown made to reporters after Saturday's game against the San Antonio Spurs, as well as at least 2 posts on social media platform X. Brown didn't hold back in his assessment, telling reporters he felt the Spurs got away with a lot and expressing frustration with what he called officiating inconsistency. Most notably, Brown made it clear he knew exactly what was coming. "I'll accept the fine at this point." His comments were direct and unfiltered. Brown questioned the defensive capabilities being credited to San Antonio, criticized what he described as touch fouls being called against Boston, while physical play went uncalled on the other end, and specifically referenced a pattern he'd noticed when the Celtics faced quality opponents. He asked for someone to pull up the clips, frustrated by what he perceived as a recurring issue. The comments were the kind that typically draw league discipline, and Brown seemed fully aware of the consequences even as he delivered them. For a player of Brown's caliber, an all-star, a championship contributor, someone who typically maintains professionalism in public settings, the willingness to speak so bluntly suggests something deeper than simple post-game frustration. And according to sources close to the situation, Saturday night's eruption was the visible culmination of tensions that had been building inside the Celtics organization for weeks. People familiar with the matter say the frustration within Boston's locker room regarding officiating had reached a critical point well before Brown's public comments. According to those briefed on internal discussions, players had been privately expressing concerns about what they perceived as inconsistent foul calls, particularly in games against top-tier opponents. Sources say these conversations intensified over the past month, with several players comparing notes about specific sequences where they felt physical play was allowed on one end but called tightly on the other. What hasn't been reported publicly, according to people close to the team, is that Brown's comments didn't happen in isolation. Sources say there had been ongoing debates within the Celtics organization about whether someone needed to speak out publicly about the officiating patterns they believed they were experiencing. The coaching staff, according to those familiar with the discussions, had reportedly been documenting specific plays and sequences throughout the season, building what one person described as an informal case file of questionable calls. Behind the scenes, according to people briefed on the situation, there was reportedly division about the best approach. One faction within the organization, sources say, believed that public criticism would only make matters worse, that complaining about officials historically leads to even less favorable treatment in subsequent games. But another group, according to those familiar with the internal debates, felt that silence was enabling a pattern that was negatively impacting the team's championship aspirations. The game against San Antonio, according to sources close to the situation, served as a tipping point. People familiar with the matter say the Celtics entered that matchup expecting physical defense from the Spurs, but felt unprepared for what they perceived as a significant disparity in how contact was being called. During halftime, according to those briefed on the locker room atmosphere, several players expressed frustration about specific sequences. The coaching staff reportedly tried to refocus the team on execution rather than officiating. But sources say the frustration was palpable. What made the situation particularly combustible, according to people close to the team, was Brown's personal investment in the issue. Sources say Brown had been reviewing film throughout the season, not just of his own games, but of other Celtics matchups, trying to identify patterns in how games were being officiated. People familiar with his mindset describe him as someone who approaches basketball analytically and was genuinely troubled by what he believed were demonstrable inconsistencies that affected competitive outcomes. In the period leading up to Saturday's game, according to those briefed on the matter, Brown had reportedly discussed with teammates the possibility of speaking out publicly if the officiating patterns continued. Sources say he viewed it as a calculated decision, accepting that a fine would come, but believing the public attention might force the league to examine whether legitimate concerns existed. People close to Brown describe this as consistent with his approach to advocacy on other issues where he's been willing to accept consequences for speaking what he believes is truth. The decision to go public, according to sources familiar with Brown's thinking, wasn't made impulsively in the heat of post-game emotion. People briefed on the situation say Brown had essentially decided before Saturday's game that if the officiating matched the patterns he'd been tracking, he would use his post-game media availability to address it directly. The specific comments, asking someone to pull up the clips, referencing it being the same S every time we play a good team, reportedly reflected frustration that had been building over multiple games and weeks. What complicates the narrative, according to people close to the organization, is that the Celtics front office wasn't necessarily aligned with Brown's approach. Sources say team leadership understood the frustration, but had concerns about the potential ramifications of public criticism. People familiar with internal discussions describe conversations where front office personnel weighed whether Brown's comments might lead to even more challenging officiating in future games, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy that could damage the team's title chances. Behind the scenes, according to those briefed on the matter, there were reportedly hurried conversations between Brown and team leadership in the hours after his post-game comments, but before the social media posts. Sources say some within the organization hoped Brown might clarify or soften his position before it escalated further. Instead, people familiar with the situation say Brown doubled down on social media, reinforcing his position and making it clear this wasn't a momentary outburst, but a considered stance. The coaching staff's position, according to people close to the team, was reportedly more nuanced. Sources say head coach Joe Mazzulla and his assistants understood Brown's frustration and privately agreed that certain officiating patterns warranted attention. But people familiar with their thinking say they also worried about creating an excuse-making culture where players focused more on officiating than execution. The balance between validating legitimate concerns and maintaining competitive focus created internal tension that several sources described as difficult to navigate. What made the situation particularly interesting, according to league sources, was the timing. People familiar with NBA officiating protocols say the league typically reviews player complaints privately, especially when they come through proper channels. Brown's decision to go public, sources say, essentially forced the league's hand. They had to respond visibly to maintain the integrity of their officiating program and deter other players from similar public criticism. The $35,000 fine, according to those familiar with the league's thinking, was both punishment and message. But there was also reportedly genuine consideration within league circles, according to sources, about whether Brown's specific complaints had merit. People briefed on internal league discussions say officials reviewed the San Antonio game film, specifically to determine if the statistical, foul, differential, and specific sequences supported Brown's allegations of inconsistency. What those reviews concluded, according to sources, remains unclear. The league doesn't typically publicize such internal assessments. But people familiar with the process say there was acknowledgement that physical games create inherently difficult officiating situations where reasonable people can disagree about appropriate calls. Within the Celtics locker room, according to sources close to the team, Brown's willingness to accept the fine generated mixed reactions. Some teammates reportedly expressed private support, appreciating that Brown was willing to take the financial hit to voice collective frustration. Others, according to people familiar with the dynamics, worried that the attention might create additional pressure in future games or paint the team as complainers rather than competitors. The financial impact itself, according to sources, was relatively minimal for someone of Brown's earning capacity. People close to his situation say he viewed the $35,000 as essentially a speaking fee, the cost of using his platform to address what he believed was a legitimate competitive concern. This framing, sources say, was consistent with Brown's approach to other advocacy issues where he's calculated the cost of speaking out against the importance of the message. What remained uncertain in the days following the fine, according to people familiar with the situation, was whether Brown's public stance would actually influence anything. League sources suggested that officiating crews don't consciously retaliate against players who criticize them, but acknowledge that heightened attention to a specific player or team can create subconscious awareness that affects how borderline calls are made. Whether Brown's comments would lead to more favorable, less favorable, or unchanged officiating in future Celtics games became a topic of speculation within NBA circles. Behind the scenes, according to sources close to the Celtics, there was reportedly ongoing discussion about whether other players might follow Brown's example if officiating concerns persisted. People familiar with internal conversations say the question of whether this was a one-time statement or the beginning of a more sustained public campaign remained open. Some within the organization, sources say, hoped Brown's comments would be sufficient to draw attention without requiring additional players to risk fines of their own. The league's response, according to those familiar with the NBA's position, extended beyond just the fine. Sources say there were private communications between league officials and Celtics leadership designed to establish better channels for addressing officiating concerns without public confrontation. Whether those channels would prove effective, people briefed on the conversations acknowledged would determine if similar incidents could be avoided in the future. As the news cycle moved forward and the fine became official, the basketball world was left to interpret what had actually transpired. Was this a player standing up for legitimate competitive concerns? Or was it post-game frustration being dressed up as principled advocacy? For Jaylen Brown, the answer seemed clear. He'd identified what he believed was a pattern, calculated the cost of addressing it publicly, and accepted the consequences without hesitation. Whether the $35,000 investment would yield any return remained to be seen.